One more question. Okay. What was sorry. I got one more question just now. What was the connection of Jesus' human soul to the beatific vision, seeing God face to face, in relation to Adam and Eve before the fall? That's a great question. In other words, Jesus' knowledge of the Father, his beatific vision, is that the same as what Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Paradise, in the Garden of Eden? And the answer is no. Adam and Eve did not see God face to face with the beatific vision. But the text tells us that they walked with God in the garden. What does that mean? That means an intimate friendship with God like that of Moses. In other words, they were given some infused knowledge of God. And we call that, in theological terms, it was one of the preternatural gifts that was given to Adam and Eve, that they had infused knowledge of God. Not just as we do, knowledge of God as creator. By looking at the world, we can deduce that there's a creator. But Adam and Eve were given some infused knowledge of God's presence, and so some intimate friendship with him. And that's expressed in the language of Genesis by saying, walking with him in the garden, in the cool of the evening. Right? That's a figurative way of expressing that infused knowledge. But see, what did they do afterwards? They sinned. Right? They sinned. And could you sin if you saw God face to face? The beatific vision. In other words, if you saw the full glory of God, you saw everything that God is. That means to see his infinite love, to see his infinite goodness. If you see God's infinite goodness, do you think you could prefer something else to God's infinite goodness? No way. Just as in this life, can we prefer something else to happiness? No, none of us cannot want to be happy. We all want to be happy. And everything we do, even if it's terribly mistaken, is to be happy. Even if it's suicide, we're still doing that so as not to suffer. And so, just as we can't not want to be happy in this life, anyone who sees God can't not love God, because they see that he is happiness. He is the good. He is the infinite goodness. So if Adam and Eve saw God, they couldn't have sinned. They did sin, therefore they didn't see him in that way that Jesus did. The same thing goes of the angels in their creation. When God created the angels, they couldn't see him face to face. And that's why they could sin. They had a trial, the angels. It was an instantaneous trial, fitting for an angelic nature. It lasted 1 instant. But in that instant, they couldn't yet see God. They knew him in faith. And they could therefore love him above self, or love self above him. You can't love self above God if you see God. So they didn't see him. The angels now, of course, see him. After their trial, the good angels immediately were given the vision. And today Adam and Eve see God. Jesus took them out of hell. We saw a couple of weeks ago when we looked at the harrowing of hell on Holy Saturday. He brought the just souls of ancient Israel, including Adam and Eve, to the beatific vision. But they couldn't see him in the garden. Right? It's a great question. And that, of course, is why Jesus could not sin. Jesus was impeccable. He was impeccable because he's God. Right? God, it's incompatible with God to sin. But he also couldn't sin because he could see God. He couldn't prefer something else. That didn't take away his freedom, though. He was still free. He was free to choose this or that. But he couldn't sin.
What about Mary?
Mary was not impeccable because Mary didn't yet see God. In her pilgrimage of her earthly life, she wasn't given the beatific vision. At least there's no reason to think that she did. And so she was peccable. She could sin, but she never did. So she never committed one sin, obviously not mortal, nor venial, nor even any imperfection, but she could have. She was free. But she perfectly cooperated with God's grace. All right? So, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to read the questions and then respond. Okay, here's a question. If Christ sees the mystical body of Christ before him in the beatific vision, What does that imply for people who are not members of the mystical body? Because Pius XII said in his encyclical that he has all the members of his mystical body before him in the crib, Gethsemane. Well, what about Muslims? What about Jews? What about atheists? Of course, he has everyone. He had everyone before his eyes, because everyone for him is someone for whom he was going to shed his blood. No one accepted. That's a dogma of faith, that Christ shed his blood for every human being, for the sins of all mankind. Not just for Catholics, obviously, not just for Christians, but for all mankind. And it's a heresy to limit it to, he only shed, that was a Calvinist idea, that Christ only died for the predestined. And the Jansenists also held that. No, Christ died for every human being. And therefore he had every human being before him in the Garden of Gethsemane, in Calvary, in Bethlehem, and he offered his sacrifice for every human being. He knew that not all would accept his grace. We don't know who does. That's God alone knows that. But Christ knew that. And that was part of his agony in Gethsemane, was knowing that his blood was not perhaps going to be efficacious for this one whom he loved, or that one. So that was part of his agony. But certainly he shed his blood for everyone, and he had everyone before his eyes. A very good question. Here's a more particular thing. I mentioned in the Sermon on the Mount, when he speaks of the sixth commandment, the question asks, is there some dispute whether Jesus approved of divorce on the ground of unchastity? And that's what the text says. It says, you have heard it said that you can give a bill of divorce, but I say to you, anyone who divorces his wife, except for unchastity, makes her an adulteress and becomes an adulterer, etc. That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 30, I guess. And the way that the church understands that condition, except for unchastity, is that under the condition, if your spouse is unfaithful, it's permitted to be separated. Right? That's how the early church understood that text. But normally you can't separate. I mean, if you're married, you can't just voluntarily separate yourself from your spouse, because you have to live together, unless there's some grave reason of supporting your family. But if your spouse is unfaithful, then it would be possible to get a canonical separation. But that doesn't enable you to remarry. And so that's the way that the early church understood that text, and the way the church has always understood that text. Right? So that's the right interpretation. Another question. Why did Christ all but 2 or 3 times refer to himself as Son of Man rather than the Christ? It's interesting. He never spoke of himself as the Messiah. And when he asked his disciples, his apostles, who do people say that I am, and who do you say that I am? Right? Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus tells them to keep quiet about that for the time. And the reason is because probably, we don't know, but this is what theologians think, that people had very often a mistaken idea about the Messiah. They were expecting a temporal Messiah who was going to be a general who was going to free Israel from Roman dominion. And that, of course, would immediately put him in clash with Pontius Pilate and with the Roman authorities. And that was not what he came to do. And so he didn't speak of himself as the Messiah, for one thing, to avoid that false kind of interpretation of his mission. But it's also for a motive of humility, I think. He stressed, above all, what was most humble in him, which was that he's the Son of Man. In other words, he's the Son of God and the Son of Man. 2 natures, perfect God, perfect man. And so he's true man, he's the Son of Man. Son of Man in Hebrew. Son of, Hebrew is a very concrete language. And so when you want to, it doesn't have abstract philosophical terms like humanity, or it does, they're modern, but ancient Hebrew, to say that kind of thing, it says it in a concrete way, son of. So to say that you're of the species dog, in ancient Hebrew you'd say you're a son of a dog. And to say that you're man, you say you're a son of man. And to say that you're God, you say son of God. Right? That's what Jesus did. So he's underlining, emphasizing his true humanity to say that he was the Son of Man. But he's not just any man. He is the Son of Man. That's like saying the man. And, of course, he gave his mother the same title at the foot of the cross. And in Cana, when he worked his first miracle, he called her woman, as if she was the woman. And it sounds harsh to our ears. We wonder, why did he call her woman and not mother? But in a way, he's saying she is the woman alluded to in Genesis. After being expelled from the garden, there was the prophecy that to Eve that the woman and her seed would crush the head of the serpent. Anyway, so Mary is the woman and Jesus is the man. So that's the meaning of that title, Son of Man. It also refers to a prophecy of Daniel chapter 7, in which Daniel sees this vision of heaven. He sees the celestial court, he sees the Ancient of Days. And before the Ancient of Days, God the Father, he sees one like a Son of Man appear before him. And to him is given dominion, kingdom, a reign that is everlasting, and so forth. And that's obviously a prophecy. That's a prophetic vision that Daniel had of Christ in his humanity, receiving dominion as the King of Kings. And so the Son of Man also refers to that vision of Daniel. And Jesus referred to it before in the Sanhedrin in his trial, when Caiaphas asked him, tell me by the name of the living God, are you the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the Son of the Most High? And he says, I am. And he makes reference to that prophecy of Daniel. He says, and you shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. That's a reference to that prophecy of Daniel, and it refers to the second coming, in which he'll come on the clouds of heaven with his glory. Okay, so that's the Son of Man. It's a mysterious title. Okay. There's a question here about my conversion, but here's another question. I believe that Jesus had the beatific vision, but why did he have to have the beatific vision in order to reveal the Father? Couldn't the revelation have come through infused knowledge that was like Moses but greater than the infused knowledge received by Moses? That's a good question. It's a great question. In other words, why did he have to have the beatific vision in his human soul during his earthly life? Wouldn't it have been enough for him to just receive a prophetic vision like Moses, but to a higher degree? Well, I would say no. It's difficult to explain this, but I would say no, because the difference between Jesus and Moses isn't simply a matter of degree, obviously, right? Because Moses, the letter to the Hebrews tells us Moses was a servant in the house, but Jesus is the son, the Lord of the house, the builder of the house. And so there's a difference between the knowledge given to the servant and the knowledge proper to the son, who's the builder of the house. The builder has to have a fuller knowledge than the servant in the house. And so the son had to have a fuller knowledge. He had to have a face-to-face knowledge of the Father, because that was his mission, to reveal the Father in his own person. Right? How could he reveal the Father? Because we saw in the Last Supper, Philip asked him, Lord, show us the Father, and that'll be enough for me. And so what does Jesus say? He says, he who has seen me has seen the Father, because the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Could Jesus have said that if he just had a kind of prophetic, dim vision through the mirror darkly, like Moses? I don't think so. And he wouldn't be able to reveal the Father unless he saw the Father in a way proper to the Son. Even in his humanity, he's obviously, in his divinity, he knows the Father perfectly. But in his humanity, he also had to know the Father face to face in order to know that he's the Son and to be able to reveal him through his words, but not just through his words, through everything that he did, through his being. He reveals the Father, Jesus tells us, through his entire being. And he can do that because he knows the Father in his humanity perfectly, and not through a mirror darkly. So I don't think he could have done this. Now, this is a disputed point among contemporary theologians, but not among the doctors of the church. All the doctors of the church unanimously teach what we said today, that Christ had the beatific vision during his earthly life, The popes have taught it. Pius XII taught it in an encyclical. So it's ordinary magisterium of the Church. The Catechism teaches it, although it doesn't use that exact term, but it teaches the substance of it. And Benedict very clearly teaches it in his book, Jesus of Nazareth. Nevertheless, this book is not magisterium. He's wanted to write it as a theologian, but nevertheless, it's very good doctrine. So I would say that it would be much better to side with the view of all of those sources: Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, Pius XII, John Paul II, and Benedict. Anyway, but the question is, why does it have to be? I think the reason is precisely because he's son, and not just a servant of the house. So he has to know the Father face to face. Okay, very good question. And this is just a little point. Was Moses the son of an Egyptian pharaoh? Obviously, Moses is the son of from the tribe of Levi, of the Jewish people, raised by Pharaoh's daughter. Nevertheless, I think the question comes from the fact that some people, Freud in particular, Sigmund Freud, wrote a book on Moses called Moses and Monotheism. It's a terrible book. I don't recommend anybody read it. It's crazy. It's off the wall. Sorry, with all due respect. And in it, he speculates that there were two Moseses. There was the Jewish Moses and an Egyptian Moses who was the son of Pharaoh, and the two got somehow put together in the biblical narrative. But that kind of hypothesis, for one thing, people throw out these hypotheses, but there's no way to check them. If you were to do something like that in science, you'd be laughed off the stage, because if you say something and there's no way that you can make an experiment to prove or disprove it, it has no value in science. And so a historical hypothesis about, I don't know, maybe Moses was, maybe there were two Moseses, it has no value because there are no documents on which it's based. I mean, it's thought up by Sigmund Freud in 1940. So anyway, I mean, the Bible is a trustworthy historical source. And it's an incredibly ancient source that has come down to us in texts that go back to the beginning of Christianity and earlier. I mean, we have texts from the caves of Qumran that were obviously written at the time of Jesus. And we have the very parchments. Anyway, we could talk more about that some other time. It's 9 o'clock. This last question here asks about the conversion. Can you tell the story of your conversion? If not tonight, maybe at some later date. Since it's 9 o'clock, I think I'll go for the latter version. But I think it's going to be in the newsletter of the Association of Hebrew Catholics, so anybody can look at it there. You want to hear it from me? Okay. I can give a very brief version of it. But I think I'll wait till next. I'll let you read it in the newsletter.
Wouldn't everyone like to hear it? Yeah.
I'll let you go home tonight.